Get on the ground now. Don't make me say it twice. Those were the first words spoken to Major General Marcus Whitfield on the morning of October the 14th, on the sidewalk in front of his own house, by a man who had never once run his license plate. Whitfield did not move. He did not raise his voice, and he did not raise his hands above his shoulders either, just enough to show they were empty. 58 years old, 6'3", dressed in a faded gray hoodie, with a cracked print across the chest that used to say Army before 300 washes, wore it down to a ghost of gray thread. He looked to the man pointing a flashlight at his face, like exactly what he had decided to see. 3 miles away, inside a command vehicle idling at the gates of Fort Kessler, a radio operator was about to hear something that would end a career before the sun finished rising. But that part comes later. First, rewind 6 hours to a house on Larkspur Hollow Road, where the coffee maker clicked on at 5:10 a.m., the way it did every single day of the general's adult life, whether he was in Kandahar or in a cul-de-sac in Briarcliff Estates, Virginia. Briarcliff Estates smelled like cut grass and cold stone that morning. It was the kind of neighborhood where the hedges were trimmed with a level, where the security cameras were disguised as garden lanterns, and where a house didn't sell for less than $2 million unless something was badly wrong with the foundation. General Whitfield had bought the place 4 weeks earlier, after the Pentagon reassigned him to take command of the newly reorganized Joint Readiness Center at Fort Kessler. He hadn't hung a single picture yet. Boxes still lined the hallway like a small cardboard skyline. But the coffee maker was plugged in on day one, because some habits are older than the furniture. At 5:40 he laced up his running shoes. The same pair he'd worn through 2 deployments. Resoled twice, because a man who has watched soldiers die over supply requisitions does not throw away a good pair of shoes just because they're scuffed. He clipped a small wireless earpiece into his left ear. On the other end, half a world away in time zones, but only 15 minutes away in miles, his aide-de-camp, Colonel Anthony Reyes, was already reading him the overnight briefing in a low, steady murmur. "Sir, overnight sitrep from J2 is light. Nothing that can't wait until 0800. "Good," Whitfield said, stepping out into the gray dawn. "Then let's talk about something that matters. How's your daughter's science fair project coming?" That was the general people never saw in the news clippings. Not the ribbons, not the silver star, not the photograph from the ceremony 3 weeks earlier, where he stood in a press dress uniform shaking the hand of a 2-star general who would soon be shaking his own hand as an equal. The real general was the one who remembered a colonel's daughter had a volcano made of baking soda due on Thursday. Under his hoodie, resting against his sternum on a beaded chain, was a set of dog tags that did not belong to him. They belonged to his father, Elijah Whitfield, who had spent 2 years peeling potatoes and hauling ammunition crates in a segregated unit in 1953, and who had been turned away from the front gate of a base in Georgia 3 separate times by 3 different guards who could not believe the uniform belonged to the man wearing it. Elijah never made it past corporal. He came home, opened a shoe repair shop in Danville, and never once told his son to be angry about it. "Be right," his father used to say, sanding down the heel of a boot. Let being right outlast their permission to see it. Marcus Whitfield had carried those 4 words through 2 wars and 11 promotion boards. He touched the dog tags now, out of habit, the metal already warm from his skin. Then he began his walk, the earpiece murmuring softly, his shoulders squared out of muscle memory rather than intention, moving through a subdivision where nobody knew his name yet, and one man was about to make sure that stayed true for as long as legally possible. 2 blocks over, a Briarcliff Municipal Patrol cruiser rolled through the development at 11 miles an hour, windows up, engine humming. Behind the wheel sat Officer Wesley Bratton, 7 years on the force, a jaw permanently set at the angle of a man convinced the world owed him deference and had simply forgotten to deliver it. Bratton had a file back at the precinct that ran to 4 folders: 11 citizen complaints, 3 internal affairs referrals, and a union rep who knew every one of them by first name. None of it had ever cost him a single day of pay. In the passenger seat, 24-year-old rookie officer Ty Sutton was 6 months out of the academy and still believed the manual meant something. He'd grown up 2 towns over, in a house where his mother worked double shifts at a hospital laundry, and he still flinched a little every time Bratton cut a corner he'd been taught not to cut. "There's been 3 package thefts on cobblestone the last 2 weeks, Bratton said, tapping the wheel. "Whoever's doing it is scouting on foot early morning, before the cameras get good light." "We don't have a description," Sutton said. "Don't need one." Bratton's eyes had already locked onto a figure 100 yards ahead, moving at an easy jog past the stone retaining wall on Larkspur Hollow. Gray hoodie, worn shoes. Bratton felt something settle into place inside him, something that had nothing to do with police work and everything to do with 40 years of unexamined instinct. Look at that. $2 million houses and a guy dressed like he slept in a bus station. "Could be jogging," Sutton offered. "Nobody jogs in a hoodie that beat up in a neighborhood like this," Bratton said, already swinging the cruiser toward the curb. "I know what doesn't belong here." He did not know it yet, but 3 miles away, at Fort Kessler's main gate, duty sergeant was glancing at a clock and thinking about nothing more dramatic than his lunch break. That would change in less than 40 minutes. Keep that clock in mind. It matters later. The cruiser stopped hard enough to chirp its tires. Bratton stepped out before the vehicle had fully settled, one hand already resting on the grip of his sidearm, which is a detail that would come up again, under oath, in a courtroom, played back through a recording no one in that car knew existed. "Hey, hands where I can see them." General Whitfield stopped, turned, and stood up to his full height, without hurry, the posture of 31 years of formation drills asserting itself before he even decided to let it. He did not raise his hands in alarm. He simply opened them, palms out, at waist height, the universal signal of a man with nothing to hide and nothing to prove. "Good morning, officer," he said. His voice was low, even, carrying the particular calm of someone who had once negotiated a checkpoint standoff without anyone firing a shot. "Is there a problem?" "I'm asking the questions," Bratton snapped, closing the distance until he was inside arm's reach. "What are you doing out here?" "Walking. I live at the end of this street." Bratton laughed, a short, ugly bark, the kind of laugh that already knows it's wrong and doesn't care. "You live on Larkspur Hollow." "Number 11, Whitfield said. "I closed on the house 3 weeks ago." "Sure you did." Bratton's hand tightened on his belt. "Let's see some ID." This is the part of the story where most reasonable people would have simply produced a wallet, ended the conversation in 90 seconds, and gone home to a cup of coffee that was, by now, getting cold on the kitchen counter. General Whitfield very nearly did exactly that. But 3 decades of leadership had taught him something quieter and more dangerous than compliance, that some situations need to be allowed to fully reveal themselves, because a man who is stopped only halfway from doing something wrong will simply do it again to someone with less power to survive it. "Officer," Whitfield said, his tone dropping half a register, "I am standing on the edge of my own property, dressed for a run, breaking no law that I'm aware of. Unless you have reasonable suspicion of a specific crime, I am under no obligation to identify myself to you. I'd ask that you take a breath and reconsider your approach." Bratton's face went the color of a struck match. "That's it," he said. "Hands behind your back." He lunged forward and seized Whitfield's left wrist. And here is the frozen moment. The first one. The one the story needs you to sit inside for just a second before it moves on. The morning went completely silent. No birds. No traffic. Just the small, specific sound of a hand closing around a wrist, and the almost inaudible click of a decision being made inside a man's chest. General Whitfield's entire body understood, in that half-second, exactly how to break the grip, exactly how many seconds it would take to have Bratton disarmed and face down on his own sidewalk. He had done it in training 1,000 times. He had done it for real more than once, in places far worse than a gated Virginia cul-de-sac. He let his arm go loose instead. "I am not resisting," he said, loud and clear, angled slightly toward his own collar, where a small earpiece had slipped from his ear during the struggle and now sat nestled in the hood of his sweatshirt, still transmitting every word to a colonel 3 miles away who had gone completely, dangerously still. "I am complying fully. This is an unlawful detention on my own property." "Save it," Bratton grunted, wrenching the arm harder than the compliance required, driving Whitfield's cheek against the cold metal of the cruiser's hood. Sutton flinched from 6 feet away, oped his mouth, and, this is the truth about most witnesses, the truth the story needs you to sit with, said nothing at all. Not yet. Bratton found the wallet in the hoodie's front pocket, slim, black leather, soft with age. He flipped it open under the rising sun. A Virginia driver's license. A Department of Defense identification card with a barcode strip and a hologram seal that most people had never learned to read properly, because most people never needed to. David Whitfield, Danville address. Bratton snorted. "Told you, this isn't even your neighborhood. That's my father's old license, kept behind my own for sentimental reasons," Whitfield said evenly. "Look behind it." Bratton pulled the military ID instead, glanced at it for less than 2 seconds, and tossed it back into the wallet with the contempt of a man who has already decided what a photograph means before he's finished looking at it. "Fake badge. You buy this online?" Sutton stepped closer despite himself. "Wait, Wes, let me see that. That looked like a real DOD card." "It's fake, Ty. Get back in the car." He wasn't fake. He was a 2-star general standing in his own front yard, with his cheek pressed against a police cruiser, and in exactly 19 minutes, the entire United States Army was going to agree with him. Bratton shoved him into the back seat, deliberately pressing down on the back of his neck so his head clipped the doorframe on the way in. The door slammed. The heat inside the cruiser rose fast under the climbing sun, and in the front seat, Officer Ty Sutton sat rigid, staring through the plexiglass partition at a man whose eyes, reflected in the rearview mirror, held no fear at all, only the patient, terrible calm of someone counting down a clock that the men in the front seat couldn't see. Wes, I looked at that card. That wasn't fake. I want to run it before we book him." "You want to question me, Sutton? 6 months on the job and you want to question me?" Through the grated partition, General Whitfield spoke again, quiet enough that it took Bratton a moment to realize he was even talking. "Officer, I'm formally requesting you contact your watch commander before this vehicle moves another mile. You have one chance to correct this before it leaves your hands." Bratton laughed and put the car in drive. "You watch too many movies, old man." "Very well," Whitfield said, leaning back. "You were warned." 10 miles away, at the gate of Fort Kessler, 3 matte black armored Suburbans and 2 military police cruisers were already rolling, lights flashing, sirens beginning to climb. In the lead vehicle sat Lieutenant General Harold Voss, base commander, a man who did not tolerate mistakes on a good day, and was, at that particular moment, having a very bad one. "Intercept that cruiser before it reaches the precinct," he said into an encrypted radio, his voice flat with a fury that had nowhere yet to land. "And get me every badge number on that vehicle." Back in the patrol car, the silence had turned suffocating. Sutton's stomach had begun to actively hurt, the specific nausea of watching a mistake accelerate past the point where anyone could still stop it politely. He pulled his phone from his vest, shielded the screen from Bratton's side mirror, and typed the name from the driver's license Whitfield, David, adding military and Virginia, his thumb trembling slightly on the glass. The search results loaded in under 2 seconds. A Department of Defense press release, dated 3 weeks earlier. A photograph of the man now sitting 11 inches behind him, except in this photograph, he wasn't wearing a faded gray hoodie. He was in dress uniform, ribbons across his chest, including a silver star and a bronze star, 2 silver stars gleaming on each shoulder. The headline read, Major General Marcus Whitfield assumes command of Joint Reconnaissance, Fort Kessler. Sutton's mouth went completely dry. Wes, his voice cracked. Wes, pull over right now. We're 4 minutes from the station, kid. Hold your... Look at this. Sutton shoved the phone into Bratton's line of sight, nearly clipping the wheel. That's him. That's the guy in the back seat. He's not a suspect. He's the new base commander at Fort Kessler. That's a coincidence, Bratton snapped, swatting the phone away so hard it hit the dashboard. Or he stole a dead man's identity. That badge in his wallet felt cheap. It's fake. You didn't even read it, Sutton said, his voice rising now, panic breaking through years of deference to seniority. We are currently kidnapping a 2-star general, Wes. Do you understand what that means for both of us? Shut your mouth, Sutton, or I'll have you riding a desk until you're 40. The radio crackled before Sutton could answer. Unit 4 Bravo, dispatch. Pull over and hold your position immediately. We are receiving priority traffic from the Department of Defense. Do not repeat. Do not proceed to the precinct. Bratton's knuckles went white on the wheel. This is a setup, he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. Somebody's playing games on the radio. He pressed the accelerator instead of the brake. And that decision, that one, small, stubborn, entirely avoidable decision, is the exact moment the story stops being a misunderstanding and becomes something that will follow Wesley Bratton for the rest of his life. Cresting the rise on Millbrook Parkway, they saw it. 3 black Suburbans and 2 military police cruisers, and coming the other direction at a speed that made the asphalt seem to shudder. The lead vehicle didn't slow to pass. It swung directly across the double yellow line and blocked the road entire, forcing Bratton into a skidding, tire-screaming stop that threw both men against their belts. The military cruisers boxed him in from behind. Before the dust had even settled, doors flew open. A dozen military police in full tactical gear fanned out with the practiced, silent precision of men who train for exactly this and had never once expected to use it on a domestic street. Hands on the dash. Both hands now. Sutton slapped his palms against the windshield so fast he nearly cracked the glass. Bratton froze, his face draining of every trace of color it had carried 30 seconds earlier. His hands rising in the exact same motion he had refused to accept from the man in his back seat less than 20 minutes before. The predator had become, quite suddenly and completely, the thing being hunted. Lieutenant General Voss stepped out of the lead Suburban and walked toward the cruiser, with the unhurried, terrible calm of a man who has already decided exactly how this ends. He did not tap on the glass. He simply looked through it until Bratton, hands shaking, found the switch and rolled the window down himself. I am Lieutenant General Harold Voss, commander of Fort Kessler, Voss said, his voice dangerously quiet. Step out of the vehicle. Keep your hands where my men can see them. Sir, I'm operating under municipal jurisdiction, Bratton started, some reflexive scrap of authority still clinging to his voice. You don't have legal. You have exactly one more sentence before my men remove you through that window, Voss said. I would spend it wisely. Sutton was already out of the car, hands raised, babbling something about having tried to warn him, about having shown him the article, about not wanting any part of what was about to happen. Bratton stepped out last, and 2 military police pinned him against his own cruiser and stripped the service weapon from his holster in a single motion, tossing it onto the hood the way he had once tossed a black leather wallet back at a man who had done nothing wrong. Voss walked to the rear door. He looked through the glass and saw a man who had once carried him, bleeding 400 meters under fire outside Kandahar a decade earlier. Sitting handcuffed in the back of a Briarcliff police cruiser in a faded gray hoodie, his cheek still marked from the cruiser's hood. A muscle in Voss's jaw worked once, hard, and then went still. "Open this door," he said without turning around. Sutton fumbled the keys twice before he managed it. Whitfield stepped out into the morning air, straightened his shoulders, and rubbed the raw red lines circling both wrists. "Sir," Voss said, snapping a crisp salute, despite the chaos around them. "At ease, Harold," Whitfield said, returning it. "Get these cuffs off, and get me Colonel Reyes on a secure line. I want the chain of custody on the dash and body cameras locked down before anyone gets a convenient equipment malfunction. Already in motion, sir." Voss turned back to Bratton, who was pinned against his own vehicle, breathing hard. "Who gave you the authority to assault and detain a commanding general of the United States Army?" "He was in a hoodie," Bratton said, the words tumbling out in a kind of panic now, the first crack finally showing in the certainty that had carried him his entire career. "There were burglaries in the area. I asked for ID. He wouldn't give it to me straight. The card looked fake." "You never ran it," Whitfield said, stepping forward, his voice still perfectly level, which somehow made it worse for Bratton than shouting would have. "You didn't see an officer's mistake, Bratton. You saw a black man in a hoodie standing in a rich neighborhood, and your mind made every decision after that for you. You didn't need a description of a suspect. You said so yourself. You knew, in your words, what didn't belong." Local backup arrived moments later, a single municipal SUV skidding to a stop, out of which stepped Sergeant Michael Boyle, Bratton's shift supervisor, a man who had spent 6 years quietly filing away every complaint against Bratton that the Union had made disappear. Boyle took one look at the armored convoy, the disarmed officer, and the two generals standing beside the wrecked Morning, and something in his face went both pale and, very faintly, relieved. "What in God's name happened here?" Boyle said. "Your officer unlawfully detained Major General Marcus Whitfield, ignored valid federal identification, and used excessive force in the process," Voss said. "The FBI will want your dash and body cam footage preserved intact, effective immediately." Boyle looked at Bratton, and for the first time in 6 years, he did not look away first. "Turn around," Boyle said quietly. "Hands behind your back, Mike, come on. It was a mistake." "A misunderstanding." "You didn't make a mistake, Wes," Boyle said, pulling his own handcuffs from his belt, the metallic click that followed landing on that empty highway with a weight nobody present would forget. "You made a choice. You ignored valid ID, and you put your hands on a man who told you the truth from the very first sentence. Turn around." The same steel that had bitten into Marcus Whitfield's wrists 20 minutes earlier now closed around Wesley Bratton's. Nobody said anything about irony. Nobody had to. Here is where the story would like you to sit for one more breath, because there is a small detail worth noticing now that will matter again later: the dog tags. Somewhere in the scuffle, they had slipped free of Whitfield's collar and hung visible against his chest, catching the morning light. Nobody in that moment understood what they meant, but hold on to them anyway. They come back. 8 months later, in courtroom 4B of the Federal Building in Richmond, the same dog tags rested under Marcus Whitfield's dress uniform collar, invisible again, silent witnesses the way they had always been. He sat in the front row of the gallery in his pristine service uniform, 2 silver stars catching the overhead lights, a row of ribbons across his chest, telling a story that had needed no lawyer to prove it. Lieutenant General Voss sat beside him, a silent wall of institutional weight. Across the aisle, Wesley Bratton sat at the defense table in an ill-fitting gray suit, 40 pounds lighter than the man who had once slammed a car door on a general's head. 8 months in pretrial detention does something to a person's posture that a union rep cannot fix with a good tie. Frank Doyle, the union representative, who had built a career on delay tactics and technicalities, sat beside him mopping his forehead with a handkerchief that had gone damp an hour into the first day of trial. Rookie officer, former officer. Now, Ty Sutton had resigned from the department 3 weeks after the incident and taken the stand on the second day of trial. He recounted, in a voice that cracked twice, how he had tried to show Bratton the press release, how Bratton had swatted the phone from his hand rather than look at it, how the entire encounter could have ended in 90 seconds with a single moment of curiosity that Bratton refused to spend. Then came the recording. Nobody in that cruiser had known the earpiece survived the struggle. Still transmitting, still live, feeding directly into a Department of Defense secure server the entire time. Assistant United States Attorney Sarah Lefisk played it for the jury without commentary, because none was needed. Bratton's own voice filled the courtroom, flat, certain, ugly, in a way that recordings tend to reveal, even when a person believes, in the moment, that they sound perfectly reasonable. Nobody jogs in a hoodie that beat up around here. I know what doesn't belong. It's a fake, Sutton. Stop questioning me. He's a nobody who wandered into the wrong zip code. 12 jurors listened to a man volunteer his own motive in real time, with no lawyer in the room to soften it for him. Major Elena Cross of the Judge Advocate General's Corps had built the federal case alongside Lennox, and it was Cross who delivered the detail that finally broke Frank Doyle's resolve entirely. A subpoenaed disciplinary file containing 11 prior complaints against Bratton for profiling and excessive force, every single one dismissed by an internal review process that the union had quietly protected for 7 years. The Department of Justice reopened every one of them the week the recording became public.
I need to confer with union leadership,
Doyle said on the third day, closing his notepad and not meeting his client's eyes. Frank, you can't leave me in here, Bratton said, grabbing his sleeve. They have you on federal audio admitting to profiling a 2-star general. Wes, Doyle said, gently prying the fingers loose. I can't fight the Department of Defense and the Department of Justice with a coincidence defense. You're on your own. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. When the forewoman read the verdict, guilty of deprivation of rights under color of law, guilty of false imprisonment, guilty of aggravated assault by a peace officer, Bratton folded forward at the defense table, and the sound that came out of him was not anger. It was the particular, hollow sound of a man finally hearing, from the outside, the version of himself he had spent 7 years refusing to see. Judge Patricia Ainsworth did not wait for a separate sentencing hearing. Federal guidelines were clear, and her patience for badge holders who had weaponized their authority had run out somewhere around the second internal affairs. Complaint Bratton had accumulated years before this case ever existed. Law enforcement is entrusted with an extraordinary power to suspend a citizen's liberty in pursuit of justice, Ainsworth said, her voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom. When that power is used as an instrument of prejudice instead, it does not simply harm one victim. It corrodes the trust an entire community depends on to survive. You looked at a decorated commanding officer, a man who has spent his adult life defending the very freedoms you abused that morning, and you saw only a target for your own bias. That was not a mistake, Mr. Bratton. That was a choice, repeated over and over, until a recording finally forced you to hear it the way everyone else did. 15 years, federal custody, no possibility of early release. A lifetime bar from any position of public trust. The gavel came down once, and federal marshals pulled Bratton's arms behind his back in the exact motion he had once used on a man who had done nothing but tell him the truth. As marshals led him past the gallery, Bratton's eyes found Whitfield's for one final second. There was no gloating in the general's face, no triumph, Just the same level, patient calm that had been there from the very first sentence on Larkspur Hollow Road 8 months earlier. The calm of a man who had never needed to raise his voice to be believed, because the truth, given enough time, tends to raise it for you. Outside the courthouse, the late spring air was warm and clean, and General Whitfield adjusted his cap on the granite steps beside Voss. "You could have broken his grip in half a second that morning," Voss said quietly. "Everyone who's ever trained with you knows that." "I know," Whitfield said. "But a man who fights back gets shot, Harold. A man who complies gets to win the argument that matters later, in a room where the truth actually gets to count for something." He touched his collar without quite meaning to, feeling the shape of the dog tags underneath. "My father never got that room. I got mine. I wasn't going to waste it." 3 months after the verdict, Fort Kessler and the city of Briarcliff launched a joint civil rights training partnership for regional law enforcement, funded quietly and without press releases. At Whitfield's insistence, Ty Sutton, the rookie who had tried and failed to stop a mistake with nothing but a phone and a trembling voice, was one of the first hires. Not as a police officer, but as an instructor, teaching new recruits exactly the lesson he had learned too late to save one particular morning, but in time, perhaps, to save the next one. On a quiet evening that fall, General Whitfield stood in the doorway of his still, half-unpacked home office on Larkspur Hollow Road, looking out at a neighborhood that had, slowly, learned his name for reasons that had nothing to do with a courtroom. He unclasped the chain at his neck and set his father's dog tags gently into a small wooden box on the windowsill, beside a photograph of a man in a 1953 uniform who had never made it past corporal and who had never once asked his son to be angry on his behalf. He only ever asked him to be right, and to let being right outlast whoever refused to see it. If this story reached something in you, not because of how it ended, but because you recognized someone in it, maybe even yourself, standing quietly in the passenger seat while a mistake got louder, that recognition is worth sitting with for a moment before you scroll on. Somewhere, right now, there is a Ty Sutton deciding whether to speak up, and a Marcus Whitfield deciding, once again, whether patience is worth the cost of being underestimated one more time. If you've ever stood in that room, on either side of it, you already know which choice is harder to live with afterward.